Welcome. We're going to finish out the semester talking a bit about a different poverty of the stimulus argument that comes from. It is about syntactic structure, but it's not exactly about structure dependence in the way that some of the earlier ones we've looked at concern structure dependence. And this is going to transition into some more general discussion of learning and learnability in linguistics and beyond. So that we'll finish up talking a little bit about Bayesian approaches to learning and inference. But for right now, we're going to look at another case of poverty of the stimulus argument that's criticized by Pullum Schulz and then is taken up by a syntactic linguistic acquisition researcher named Jeff Lidz and his colleagues. And we'll take a look at the back and forth about this one particular poverty of the stimulus argument in a way that's going to draw in some larger debates in cognitive science and linguistics more generally. So this poverty of the stimulus argument comes from anaphoric 1 in English, and this is due to Mark Baker's work in the 1970s. So he points out that in sentences like this one, John has a blue glass, but Alice doesn't have one, that there's several possible reference for the anaphoric 1 in this sentence, right? So it's one is pointing back at something that happened earlier in the discourse. In this case, it's in the same utterance. And it's ambiguous what one is pointing to here. So it has at least two relevant meanings for what we're going to be looking at. One of them is that John is holding a glass that is blue, and Alice does not have any kind of a glass at all. And so here, one is standing in for glass, more or less, a glass. So it's part of that earlier noun phrase or determiner phrase, whatever you want to call it, a blue glass. It can stand in for just glass, so Alice doesn't have a glass. But also it can be also valid in a situation where Alice is holding a glass, but it's a red one or one that isn't blue. And so in that case, it looks like one here is standing in for the entire multi-word phrase, blue glass. And so the observation here is that this type of anaphoric 1 has multiple possible reference that it might be referring to. And the question is how children would learn this, right? So what kind of primary linguistic data would you need to have evidence for the possible meanings of 1 in these situations? And the reason this is a tricky thing to learn is that in the cases where you have something like John has a blue glass and Alice has another one, or something like that, it's always going to be ambiguous. You're never going to get evidence in those situations for whether 1 means glass or whether 1 means blue glass. Why is that? Because anytime that sentence is uttered, John has a blue glass and Alice has another one, right, in a positive context here, Alice is going to be holding some kind of a blue glass, most likely. Wow, there's a hailstorm going on right now. That's what that sound is. Anytime Alice is holding a blue glass, she is also necessarily holding a glass, right? So it's always going to be the case that those positive sentences are associated with either the single word antecedent for 1 or the multi-word one. So you really need to get this embedded under negation the way it is here. So it does not have 1. You need to have a situation like that, and where Alice is holding a glass, but that glass is not blue. Really, that's the only kind of situation in which you're going to have unambiguous evidence that the anaphoric 1 here can substitute in for a multi-word antecedent. And it's unclear whether children are really getting that kind of input very often. And so this has a similar flavor to some of the earlier poverty of the stimulus arguments. We pick out this subtle fact about English syntax and semantics, and we ask, how would children possibly learn that? And we find that the lacuna, in Pullum Schulz's words, the kind of necessary data that you need to learn this kind of dependency, seems like it is very specific and unusual and probably rare. And we can wonder, did children even get that kind of input? So here's how Pullum Schulz characterized this one, and this is in parallel to the auxiliary fronting one that we looked at in the last lecture. here's what they say. The apparendum, the thing to be acquired here, is the fact that anaphoric 1 can have nominal antecedents that are larger than just the head noun. The lacuna here, the kind of data that you would need to learn this, according to the poverty of the stimulus argument, would be the set of all utterances containing anaphoric 1 that reveal in context that the antecedent of 1 cannot just be a noun. That is, examples like the one we just looked at, where Alice does have a glass. The argument that this is indispensable and that you can't learn it, the dependencies without that kind of data, is that in order to learn an instance of anaphoric 1 can have a multi-word antecedent, the learner must experience cases in which an instance of 1 unambiguously has a multi-word antecedent. Right? And the claim from Baker is that almost all the cases where you'll ever see this are going to be ambiguous between a single word antecedent and a multi-word one, and it's very, very rare to get unambiguous evidence that there's a multi-word antecedent. Right? So the inaccessibility evidence here, this is trying to show that in fact such sentences are rare, or the kinds of data you need to learn this are really unusual. Baker asserts that it's only in an unusual set of circumstances that the learner will encounter 1 in a context where the antecedent is clearly more than just a noun. So again, this is an impressionistic statement based on sort of common sense. It doesn't seem like young children are going to get many specific cases of that kind. And then the acquisition evidence would be showing that children nonetheless acquire the adult-like grammar of anaphoric 1 in the way that it's described in the syntactic literature. According to Pullum Schulz, there's no real evidence that children actually acquire this dependency. And so they're, again, picking holes in every part of this argument, but especially in the inaccessibility and acquisition evidence sides of this. And this is just like the auxiliary fronting example, except here the nature of the dependency that allegedly is being learned by native English speakers is a little bit different. And so you can guess where this is going. This is going to look a lot like the Leggett and Yang response to that earlier one. This one comes from Jeff Lidz and his colleagues. Oh, I should say, again, Pullum and Schulz do this maneuver of pulling up possibly relevant sentences from the Wall Street Journal corpus. And so arguably, these are ones where our world knowledge or our situational knowledge entails that most likely 1 is referring to some kind of a noun and its modifier. So for instance, you can teach what happens in a firing episode, he says, but each one is so different that the advice may be misleading, where the antecedent of 1 here seems like it would have to be firing episode, right? Because you wouldn't be talking about firing episodes and then just generalizing to talk about episodes in general, whether they're firing or not. This is almost unambiguously referring to firing episode, not just episode. That's the claim here, at least. And of course, again, he's bringing up these rather complex sentences from the Wall Street Journal, and it's fair to point out that this is not the kind of primary linguistic data, not the kind of input that young children learning a language actually receive. They're not reading the Wall Street Journal. Nobody is speaking the Wall Street Journal to them. So it's really unclear whether these examples are relevant at all. Where do we want to look instead if we're trying to get relevant evidence about the inaccessibility of these allegedly necessary sentences? Lidz and colleagues are going to take this on, right? This is the anaphoric 1 argument. And Leggett and Yang, as we saw last time, had an interesting form of argument here for the auxiliary fronting example. And there they showed that the relevant input doesn't occur as frequently as things that we know children learn around 3 years old, right? So they find some auxiliary fronting examples and they ask, well, this is how often these examples occurred in our child-directed speech. And we know from looking at other learned syntactic phenomena that you need about this much data to acquire something by 3 years old. We know that children acquire auxiliary fronting by 3 years old, but they have orders of magnitude less data, and so they can't have learned it from the input. That's the form of the Leggett and Yang argument. The Lidz and colleagues argument is going to be a little bit different and also interesting. So here they're going to try to show that the lacuna, again, the relevant input that would unambiguously identify the antecedent of 1 as having more than just a noun in it, they're going to show that that input occurs at a rate that is indistinguishable from things that we know children don't learn. In other words, errors in their input, or sentences that come out ill-formed, or noise as they refer to it. And I'll come back to that shortly. But this is the idea. Instead of showing that, hey, this relevant data doesn't occur frequently enough to be learned at the age that we know it's learned, instead they're going to try to show that this necessary data occurs about as often as ungrammatical things that we know children don't acquire, right? Because by the time they're adults, they find those things ungrammatical. So here's a little bit more details on what this anaphoric 1 example is about. And these are two possible hypotheses that a child might entertain about the structure of a noun phrase and the way that one refers to various antecedents. And of course, there could be more hypotheses than these. There could be hundreds or thousands of relevant hypotheses, but these are two of the most immediately relevant ones. And they're going to refer to these as the flat structure hypothesis on the left here, where the noun phrase or the determiner phrase or whatever you want to call this thing has a structure where the maximal phrase here, the maximal projection, immediately dominates 3 terminal nodes. Right? So these are just word level categories: determiner, adjective, and noun, and there's no particular internal grouping here. There's no constituency. There's no real hidden structure unless you consider the part of speech information here to be sort of covert structure. But other than that, there's no real articulated structure in here. And you would expect under this hypothesis that one could sort of substitute in for this head noun, but not necessarily for the adjective and the noun together, because they don't form a constituent in this theory. The second hypothesis here is closer to what generative syntacticians think is the right theory of how these noun phrases work. And here you have the so-called X bar architecture. What does that mean? Well, it means that actually all grouping within all maximal projections, including the noun phrase, is always binary. So two things always group together before they group together with a third thing. And this is true inside the noun phrase. And here, the adjective and the head noun form a constituent that's intermediate in size without the determiner. And in addition, there's a totally covert hidden structure intermediate level category of n bar. These are called bar level categories for whatever reason. That includes just the head noun and nothing else. And the generalization here is that one can substitute in or can refer back to any n bar constituent. So it can refer back to just the n bar that includes the word ball, or the n bar that includes the word red ball. So it should be clear here, just as in the auxiliary fronting example that we looked at earlier, one of these hypotheses is much more complicated than the other one. So this is, again, simple, complicated. And it looks like the complicated theory is closer to being right than the simple theory. And the claim here is that children don't get much evidence for this complicated analysis, yet they still somehow acquire the right generalization. Therefore, there must be something about this X-bar architecture, right, or about the presence of intermediate level phrasal categories within a phrase that's just given, that's just wired into their syntactic learning. So this is, again, a candidate for inclusion in UG is the articulated structure of phrases, of maximal projections, that they have binary subconstituents rather than being a string of undifferentiated syntactic categories. So that's the claim here. Now, again, looking at what kinds of evidence we would expect children to get about the antecedents of one, there's going to be lots of cases where, in the positive context here, where there's no negation, it's going to be often unambiguously one referring back to ball. So Chris has a red ball and Max has a blue one. Here, it's clear that one has to refer to ball only and not to red ball. There's going to be cases, many cases, where it's ambiguous between the noun antecedent and the multi-word antecedent. So Chris has a red ball and Max has another one. Well, here it could mean that Max has another ball, or it could mean that Max has another red ball. Right? And it's going to be kind of impossible to tell if Max is holding a red ball. You're never going to be able to distinguish between these two in principle. And in fact, the only unambiguous evidence you'll get that one can refer to the multi-word constituent red ball is in a context where Max has a different colored ball and this anaphor is embedded under a negation or in what's sometimes called a downward entailing context. And here's how this works out. Chris has a red ball, but Max doesn't have one. Now, if Max just isn't holding a ball, this is still going to be ambiguous. But if this sentence is uttered in a context where Max has another colored ball, then we're going to have unambiguous evidence that one here is referring to the multi-word constituent red ball. Right? So this is the claim that this is the lacuna, this is the necessary kind of linguistic input that children would need to hear in order to unambiguously know that one can refer to a multi-word antecedent, and the claim is going to be that this particular type of input in this particular context is going to be extraordinarily rare, right? That's what the generative syntax claim is. It's the one that Pullum and Schulz take issue with, and Lidz and colleagues are going to try to flesh out the evidence for that. So what did they do? Let me highlight this a little bit more. The structure of the argument here is that this type of example is necessary for children to learn that one replaces an X bar level constituent. That's one of those intermediate level groupings. And so there's two claims here. This type of example is vanishingly rare in child-directed speech. And then the second claim, they're going to try to show that nonetheless, children still know in some sense that one can replace an X bar. And here this is written, one replaces an X bar. That should really say can replace an X bar. Oh no, actually, I'm sorry. I've just talked myself into circles. We decided that there's an X bar constituent that only dominates the head noun. So it is the case in this theory that one always replaces an X bar level constituent and never a head level constituent. So therefore, the claim is children must have access to the notion X bar and the knowledge that anaphors replace X bars without learning it, because it's you're not getting the data from your primary linguistic input that would teach you this. Therefore, you must come to the learning task with this knowledge already implicit somehow. So this is, again, a claim that the category intermediate projection of a category X is present in universal grammar, and it guides the way that syntactic learning takes place. That's the claim here. So again, here's the relevant type of lacuna, the relevant type of primary linguistic data that would teach you that one can have a multi-word antecedent. And the claim from the generative syntacticians is that this type of example is vanishingly rare in child-directed speech. So instead of this sort of gimmicky Wall Street Journal type search, Lidz and his colleagues are going to go back to the child as corpus that we saw in the Leggett and Yang paper, and they're going to even use the same corpora for Nina and for Adam, because these, my understanding is that these are the two biggest corpora in the entire database. And so there's going to be lots of data in here. In fact, they found about 55,000 child-directed sentences in these two corpora, and in about 1,100 of those had some version of the English word one in them. And about 800 of those were anaphoric cases of one, not, say, numerals or counting or something like that, were actual anaphoric instances of one. Of those, the vast, vast majority, over 90%, don't have any multi-word N bars anywhere in the vicinity that they could refer back to, right? So this bottle, the car, would be examples from the corpus. In other words, if we think about, again, these red ball, blue ball examples, the vast majority of all the instances of anaphoric one that pop up in child-directed speech are in contexts not where people are talking about red balls or blue balls, but just a ball, right? In which case, you're definitely not going to be able to learn anything about multi-word antecedents from those, and that's more than 90% of the instances of anaphoric one. Of the remaining leftover sort of residue, Four of these cases are ungrammatical sentences or ungrammatical uses of one. And they don't give a lot of details in the paper here, but sleuthing a little bit on the internet, I was able to find a presentation from one of the people in Jeff Lidz's lab. And I think it looks like the examples here are things like, you must be need one, right? Where the point here is that no matter how many times children get exposed to things like this, you must be need one, they don't learn that as part of their grammar. How do we know that? Because by the time they've learned English, they know that this is an ungrammatical sentence. Of course, people still sometimes produce ungrammatical sentences every once in a while. So children must have some kind of a mechanism for discarding the ungrammatical input that they've been given. They must have a way of disregarding this kind of example. There are four such examples in this corpus. And the actual lacuna here, unambiguous multi-word n-bar antecedents of the type shown up here, are less than these errors or ungrammatical sentences. There's fewer of these than there are of literal noise and ungrammatical things that we know children don't learn in the corpus. There's only 2 examples in these 55,000 sentences. So what's the conclusion to be drawn from this? The way Lidz and colleagues put this is that the relevant type of sentence, this lacuna, occurs at a frequency indistinguishable from noise, where noise refers to things that the child correctly disregards, including ungrammatical input. Right? So we know from looking at mature English grammar that children don't hear things like, you must be need one, often enough to learn it. And we know that because by the time they're adults, it's ungrammatical. They find it unacceptable, right? So however often they're hearing sentences like that, it can't be often enough to learn it from the data. So if they hear the crucial anaphoric one sentences equally often to these ungrammatical things they don't learn, it shouldn't be often enough to learn this either, to learn about anaphoric one. That's the claim here. The crucial sentences that you would need to learn the correct theory of anaphoric one in English don't occur often enough to be learned, and we know that because there are things that occur equally often that children unambiguously don't learn, right? In other words, ungrammatical sentences. The second part of the claim here is to try to show that nonetheless, even though they don't get enough input to learn multi-word anaphoric one reference, that they still know that one replaces an X bar and that they can extend this to multi-word reference. This is trying to show that children nonetheless do acquire the correct generalization. And so here they go to an experiment, and this is sort of a stunning experiment. So they tested children who are 16 to 18 months old. These are very, very young children. So my son was barely talking at this age. These are not children with mature grammars at all. They're not producing very much in the way of syntax. These are mostly children around the 2-word stage where they can say things like, Ezra eat or something like that, but they're not creating full English sentences. These are very, very young children. And what they're doing here is they're looking at 4 pairs of questions per child that are going to try to get at this question of whether children understand at this age that one can refer to more than just the head noun. The caregivers will be present in the experiment, but they're blinded to what's going on. Probably through the use of headphones so they can't hear anything, and also so I think the stimuli are going to be visually presented and the caregivers will be obstructed from seeing the visual displays. And so children here are going to be presented with a preferential looking task. So this should be familiar from the sort of word learning and segmentation part of the class, that will distinguish between the head noun and the n-bar interpretations of anaphoric one, so those single word and multi-word ones. And experimenters will later be looking at videos of what the children are doing during this, and they'll code, hey, where are the children looking at any given time, where the experimenters themselves, when they're reviewing the video, don't know what kind of a trial was going on at the time they're coding. So this is an elaborate way of trying to keep the experimenter's expectations from biasing the results of the experiment. It's actually super important in research like this that the person coding where the children are looking doesn't know what's going on in the experiment at the time that they're coding. So these are following good practice in acquisition experiments. And so here's what the experiment looks like. Um, for each question pair, as they refer to them, there's going to be a control one that they use to establish a sort of baseline for what children generally do in this task, and then an anaphoric one where they try to see whether the differences in anaphoric one make a difference in child behavior here. So here's what they're doing. They're going to first have a familiarization phase where the child doesn't have to do anything, and they're just being shown a picture of, say, a yellow bottle, for instance. And then somebody says to the child, here's a yellow bottle. And they show them a yellow bottle. Now, here's the two kinds of other trials in the experiment. There's first the control trial, where now all of a sudden there's the familiar yellow bottle and a novel other colored bottle. And I'm going to artfully avoid describing the color of this because I'm red-green colorblind, and it's not totally clear to me what color that is, but it's certainly not yellow. And in any case, the control version here is going to be, now look, what do you see now? And we're going to track whether children are looking at the familiar yellow bottle or at the novel other colored bottle. And that's going to be a control because there's no issues about anaphor resolution here. We don't need to figure out what one refers to because there's no one in the sentence. And this is just to see, hey, what do children look at in general when you pop up a new picture like this, two new bottles like this? What do they do in general if there's no anaphor, no one ambiguity at issue? Right? And then we're going to compare that to what happens when you do have this ambiguous anaphoric use of one. And so these are the anaphoric trials that we're going to compare the controls to. Here's a yellow bottle, again, same training, but now the actual trial part of it is again showing the familiar yellow bottle and the novel other colored bottle and asking, now look, do you see another one? And here, another one could mean another bottle, or it could mean another yellow bottle. And so if children are entertaining the idea that one can have a multi-word antecedent like yellow bottle, we would expect them to spend more time looking at the familiar yellow bottle. But if it's just referring to the head noun bottle, then we'd essentially expect them to do whatever they're doing in the control condition. So, whatever their general preference is, in the case where one is standing in only for bottle, it should be equally consistent with either one of these being the referent, and so we would expect whatever preference children show in the control condition to also be there. Whereas if they're entertaining a multi-word antecedent for one, they should be more focused on the familiar yellow bottle. That's the idea of this experiment. Pretty ingenious design. Let's see how this works out. So here's the control condition. And this is looking time on the vertical axis in seconds. It's an average across 24 children. And then these are the two types of trials. The control trials are over here. And what we find is that on average, children spend about 2 seconds looking at the familiar yellow bottle in those control sentences where the question is, what do you see now? But they like to spend more time looking at the novel bottle, which is sort of unsurprising. Again, young children crave novel stuff. They like new things. And so in the default control case where there's no one resolution to think about, children prefer somewhat to look at the novel stimulus in that example that we just looked at, the non-yellow bottle, the new one, right? So they spend more time looking at that than they do at the familiar one. All of a sudden, you pop in that ambiguous anaphor one, and this preference switches sharply, where on average, children spend a longer time looking at the familiar yellow bottle in that case than they do at the novel other colored bottle. So this is pretty neat evidence that something about the anaphoric one is calling their attention to the yellow bottle. And the most plausible explanation, at least according to Lidz and colleagues, is that children know that one can be referring to yellow bottle in that situation. So they're showing that even though these children are nowhere near the stage of producing actual sentences with this kind of anaphoric ambiguity in it, at 18 months they already know how to resolve this ambiguity in their speech perception, or in their ability to understand the language around them, which is really counterintuitive and pretty impressive, at least to me. If you spent any time around 16 to 18-month-old children, they are not advanced speakers of their native languages. Yet apparently they have some very, very subtle receptive knowledge about the interpretation of ambiguous sentences, which is a pretty neat thing to see here. And this is taken as strong evidence that indeed children by 18 months have acquired the correct dependencies with regard to anaphoric 1, that they already know at this extremely early age that 1 replaces an X bar constituent. So that's the claim from Lidz and all. They also run a bunch of other control conditions and some slightly different experiments to try to clean up some loose ends here and address various possible criticisms of the study. So this expression, you might think that maybe the issue here is that they've used this expression, another one. Maybe that's just encouraging kids to look at the familiar one for some reason. So they try this also with a slightly different expression. Doesn't seem to make a difference. There's other possible interpretations of this, like maybe they're just preferring the item amongst the bottle alternatives here. That's the closest to the original trial or something like that. And so they run a couple different conditions trying to show that that's not what's going on, that the real explanation really is the multi-word antecedent. And there's a lot of details in the paper about how that's done. But the overall point here, I think, is conveyed clearly by that first experiment. And so the claim here is that from the corpus study, indeed, children don't get enough input to learn anaphoric 1 dependencies. Yet, according to the experiment, by 18 months, they have nonetheless learned anaphoric 1 dependencies, or at least they know it. Right? So if they don't have enough data to learn it, yet they somehow know it, then there must have been some kind of a learning bias guiding them towards that correct theory of anaphoric 1 resolution. Right? So this is, again, reinforcing the original poverty of the stimulus argument that was made on a kind of casual, impressionistic basis in the 1970s, and reinforcing that claim with hard data. This paper has been subjected to a lot of criticism, and that's partly because it was published in a very high-profile, prestigious journal of language sciences. It's partly because the poverty of the stimulus is just very controversial. And this is one of the strongest empirical arguments for it. So, it gets at all these grand issues in cognitive science and philosophy more generally about nativism and empiricism and rationalism. And people just get very heated about these kinds of debates. Right? And then another reason that there's been a lot of criticism here is because experimental results, and really any other kind of result, can always be sort of nitpicked and picked apart and doubted if you don't like the results. And this is true in all areas of experimental science. You'll always be able to find a way to doubt experiments, specific experiments, if you don't like what they're concluding. And there's a little bit of all of these things going on here. But in any case, the resultant debates here, and I've put a number of response papers onto not eCampus, just our course website, which would be good targets for a reaction paper if you wanted to look at some of them. In any case, there were pretty interesting debates around this. Breakstone and Rappaport-Havov give a nice overview of this back and forth in their 2012 paper. A lot of the other responses were published in the same year, in 2003, as short commentaries on the original article. And then, some years later, Breakstone and Rappaport-Havov summarize how they see the debate playing out. And it's a really nice overview there, as well as some of the individual papers I've posted on the website as well. And so there's lots of interesting things going on in this back and forth. And even though it gets sort of heated and people disagree, and in fact, I think Lidz, I found a lot of these short response articles that people wrote objecting to the experiment. They were posted on Jeff Lidz's website with the internet address, my webpage, blah.com, blah, 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 slash hate mail. So he definitely had the impression that people were not happy with his experiment and not happy with his conclusions. And so it got a little bit heated. But actually, in some sense, this is a model exchange for exactly how these kinds of arguments for poverty of the stimulus ought to be investigated, right? So Lidz and his colleagues proposed a poverty of the stimulus argument. But again, this is just the beginning of the investigation, not the end, right? So they take an earlier poverty of the stimulus argument that was proposed sort of casually and informally in the syntactic literature, and they try to show that indeed the data that you need to learn it is not available in the input. They try to show that in the thing that you're trying to acquire or learn as a target grammar, they look a little bit at the details of how that works, checking out the X-bar theory and how that could predict that you would acquire these kinds of dependencies if it were an innate bias, then try to show that you don't get data you'd need to learn it from primary linguistic data. And then other researchers come and they try to pick holes in these different arguments. And both actually have written here the indispensability argument, but also in the inaccessibility argument and in the acquisition argument. So there's lots of back and forth, and hopefully in the end, whatever conclusions survive here will be the strongest conclusions that are the most supported by evidence. So I think there are some real positive aspects of this back and forth we see in this literature about the poverty of the stimulus. And here's some of the kinds of holes that people are trying to poke in the Lidz and colleagues' work. This first one is by a gentleman named Michael Tomasello, who has made a career out of doubting the reality of any structurally complex theories of syntax or other linguistic structure. I have to say, I don't have much respect for this guy, and I think he's almost always wrong about everything and that his arguments are terrible. But that said, it might be worth looking at a little sample of his work to see what it looks like when people try to break down the entire Chomskyan linguistic enterprise. So his claim here is that maybe this phrase, another one, is a simple unanalyzed linguistic unit, and that one is not actually acting as an anaphorin here. So Lidz and colleagues come back with a slightly different experiment using a slightly different expression than another one and show that, in fact, that's not true. That's just wrong. Right? So I think they dispense with that argument pretty well. There's an interesting thread here that I think might be really worth investigating more, and suggesting that maybe the results here in this experiment are more about meaning and about inferences, reasoning, and world knowledge than they are about syntactic structure. And this is the gist of the Akhtar and colleagues' response to the Lidz experiment, and that includes Jeff Pullum as an author, I believe, as well as this later paper by Breakstone and Rappaport-Havav. These guys come up with some very interesting points about how you might get children behaving this way even if they didn't have an innate bias for X-bar architecture. There could be other kinds of innate structures to their reasoning faculties that might allow them to reach inferences like this. So these are very interesting papers, and they don't exactly claim that the poverty of the stimulus argument is wrong. It's more of a claim that the kinds of innate structure you'd need to get the anaphoric one dependencies might not be as syntactic in nature as they've been presented in the generative linguistics literature. These are very interesting papers, and I think they might be right, although, I'm not the guy who gets to decide this eventually. The one I'm going to zero in on here is interestingly different, though. And this comes from Terry Regier and Susanna Gall. And what they try to show here is that actually you might still be able to learn this generalization, not from looking at the kinds of evidence that children get, the kinds of linguistic input that they get using anaphoric 1, but from careful consideration of what they don't hear. So this is going to be a very different idea, and I'm going to zero in on this one because in the end, I don't actually think that this is a very plausible theory of these particular generalizations, but it's a good introduction to the framework of Bayesian learning and inference. And it highlights some really interesting points that are relevant in broader cognitive science. So I'll go through um, a little bit about Bayesian inference and thought in the next set of slides. We'll apply it to some general linguistic problems and then try to apply it to the specific anaphoric 1 case along the lines of what Regier and Gall do here. And then we'll, if we have time, I might try to extend that to some other areas of phonology and phonetics that we've looked at earlier in the class. Right? So here's what Regier and Gall are saying. Maybe the correct generalization about anaphoric 1 could be learned from careful consideration of what the child doesn't ever hear. And that idea is labeled in this exchange as indirect negative evidence. And Regier and Gall tie this indirect negative evidence, or INE, idea into the more general framework of Bayesian inference. And it's worth knowing something about Bayesian inference because this is one of the central paradigms in modern cognitive science. And so next, we will talk about Bayes.